Hello and welcome to this week's What Were They Thinking? Among this week's news items are various pieces of research into the Delta variant of the CCP virus and vaccine effectiveness against this strain. The various arguments made against vaccines overall, both for and against. Follow-up and admittedly long-term evaluation of drug benefits and hindrances in at least one study looking at pregnancy. There's also action being taken and then ignored against a naturopath from British Columbia. Facebook, despite all its efforts to try and quash its reputation as being the platform of choice for misinformation, continues to earn that reputation. The timestamps for these and other news items can be found in the description box below. Let's begin with the various controversies around the newest strain of the CCP virus, or at least newest strain that's causing us concern right here, right now. The Delta variant. This is highly contagious and is spreading rapidly. In most places where it's taken root, it is the dominant version of the CCP virus at the moment. Naturally, all of the vaccines that are available are made with the original strain in mind, not something new. Many people have jumped on this idea and claim that as a result, this new vaccine isn't of any benefit. That's not true. There's a reason why getting the annual influenza shot is of some benefit to you. It does impart some degree of immunological preparation. It may not be for exactly the right strain, but it does give some protection. Influenza strains are a lot more deviated from each other than the strains of the CCP virus at present. With that in mind, it is worth noting that the Delta variant is showing less effectiveness when being vaccinated for. This ranges from anything between 39% to 84%. This means there's somewhere between a marginal reduction and a significant reduction in its effectiveness. That's infections though. Infections aren't the only concern. How effective it is at preventing hospitalizations is another matter. This ranged from 95% at the high end, which is fundamentally no different to the vaccines as they are now, all the way down to 75%. Yes, it is a drop, but not as significant a drop as is sometimes purported. This research is further supported by research at the CDC. They found that in their research of this, that the more dominant the Delta variant becomes, the more likely people are to become infected and then hospitalized. There's about a 4.5-fold increase to infection and a 10-fold increase to hospitalization. This leads ultimately to an 11-fold increase in death from the CCP virus. That's a pretty big increase, no matter how you want to look at it, and no matter which of these factors you want to examine. If we take the current rate of death in America per million people, which is approximately 2,000, and we increase this by 11-fold, that's at least 22,000 people who will die from COVID this year alone, let alone if it continues to carry out. And that's at the current rate of infection, remembering it's possible for new variants and an increase in spread. With these numbers, you might already be thinking, well, why aren't people taking vaccines? And the reality is there's a lot of hesitation out there, and then this is further reinforced by misinformation. The continued claim is that vaccines are not 100% perfect, and in reality, just about nothing in life really is. Any investigation of anything will find something to pick on, no matter what it is. This is one of the reasons why vaccines are always looked at a risk to reward ratio. And for this, the COVID vaccines are significantly more beneficial than any risk associated with it. This is where we'd like to refer you to an article from the Skeptical Raptor and something that's described as the Nirvana fallacy. That is, the idea of comparing what is reality against an idealistic image of what should be happening. In this case, the idea that vaccines should be 100% effective in all cases. There's a practical reality to it that's being discounted by that belief. For example, some people may not be able to generate the appropriate B plasma cells in response to a vaccine. From this, they can't generate antibodies to whatever they're being vaccinated for. It's rare, but it does happen. It's why, in some cases, vaccines just don't provide immunity. The fact that there is a fractional percentage of 1% of the population is why this risk of not getting immunity is far outweighed by the reward of being able to immunize the remaining 99% of the population. Many people who tout this idea don't stop driving simply because there's some risk that they might be involved in a car accident. They have to practically drive in order to get to their work, groceries, deliver kids to school, whatever it happens to be. They are selectively applying this fallacy. Consider that if you're in America, there's a 0.012% of dying in a vehicle. There's a 1.6% chance of dying from the CCP virus. One of these is a much more significant risk to you personally than the other. The vaccines available for it have a remarkably low incident rate of serious adverse effects. These are things beyond soreness in the arm and slight swelling. Well below the risks that are associated with things like driving, for instance. At the same time, the benefits of not having a significantly higher risk of dying are very, very high, and so the reward by far and away outweighs any risk. This vaccine news should bear in your mind as there is a push towards immunizing younger children now for the CCP virus. One of the big reasons for this is that although children are far less likely to be infected, they can still be infected. And as many children return to school and move around their countries, either to go to school and come back home, or they go away to university and similar, they are all slowly possibly being exposed to the CCP virus and then returning it back to others who have not been infected, or in some cases have not been immunized. As a result, the decision by increasing number of governments to vaccinate children makes sense. If, for instance, children can share disease within the confines of the school and then bring it back home and infect their parents, siblings, or grandparents, you can see where a problem might start. The otherwise controllable vectors cannot be controlled when we talk about children in a school environment. This is where vaccinating children comes into play. Both Pfizer and biotech have looked at this exact environment for children between 5 and 11. Their results should unsurprisingly indicate there are no issues. This is further reflected in places like America that have been vaccinating children. In fact, millions of children. And at a minimum, none have died, which is a great place to start. But more importantly, there don't seem to be any significant side effects that have resulted in problems that are long-term that we're aware of at present. The article for this from the University of Melbourne shows some interesting statistics. In this case, if they were to vaccinate an entire state, and they were to take the most likely population to have a side effect, that being pericarditis or myocarditis, at its current rate, they would have approximately 2.5 cases. That's 2.5 cases of a condition that, in many instances, can be treated at home with medication that can be picked up from a pharmacy. Nothing that's going to destroy anyone's life, and in fact may not pose any long-term side effects other than having an interesting story for later on. The article goes on to provide some more sobering statistics. The first of these is that if there was a significant number of the teenagers who refused this, about 70%, they would then become infected. This would lead to 1,000 cases of long-term symptoms, otherwise known as long COVID. There would be 1,400 children winding up in hospital, and about 0.6% of these would then need to be put in an ICU. Compare this with no record of any kind of adverse effects in children, and suddenly the rewards seem to be significantly more beneficial than any kind of risk could possibly be. Even with that in mind, the next news item we have for you is going to explain just why we'll be aware of these problems before too long anyway. There are several steps involved in clinical trials. The first 3 are entirely focused on the trial element. Stage 4 is long-term market monitoring. This is intended for several things. In theory, it would allow companies to better refine their products and then re-release new products to market under new names and therefore under new rights to control release. This obviously generates the money. The other side of the coin is less beneficial. It also means that they have to monitor for adverse effects, and they can identify when something goes wrong systemically. This allows them to identify if something's happened wrong with a particular batch, if in some cases the product itself is flawed, and so on. This is where the examination of acetaminophen, otherwise known as Paracetamol, and perhaps if you're American, Tylenol. They were looking at the use of this during pregnancy. A group of 91 scientists looked at this and were trying to see whether or not exposure to acetaminophen while infants were growing in the womb could have led to something more serious. This leads us to just what the researchers did. Collectively, they took data from epidemiological studies, animal research, and lab-grown cell experiments between 1995 to 2020. This is something where we should point out that mixing study designs like this is not a good idea. You should try and keep them discrete and separate, as animal research, and we've mentioned this before, does not always translate to humans very well. Similarly, lab-grown cells may not translate to animals or to humans. Everything has its place and role to play in research, and mixing them like this is not a good idea. When the researchers focused on human studies in particular, they believe they found a relationship between the use of acetaminophen and neurodevelopmental disorders, things like hyperactivity, ADHD, and behavioral difficulties. Researchers have also identified some of the same flaws that we have, and notably amongst their criticism, some of the studies they've used to try and draw this conclusion are not robust enough to actually be used to support that conclusion. Overall, the research is incredibly inconsistent, and this is a problem. When you have some large-scale studies that are for and against, it indicates that there might be more to this story than is visible from a very broad strokes examination of published research. At the same time, you can't exactly go around telling some women to take acetaminophen and others not, and see which of them then report neurological developmental problems in their children. For this reason, the prudent but not unreasonable advice is to minimize the use of acetaminophen during pregnancy full stop, and to continue surveillance, the same post-market surveillance that we mentioned earlier. In news on other neurodevelopmental disorders, one study looking at an intervention for autism has reduced diagnosis rates by a very large margin. What's interesting about this is not so much that it's aiming the treatment or intervention at the autistic children themselves, but rather at their parents and getting the parents to then interact and encourage socialization and other behaviors in the children from about 2 years of age onwards. That significantly counteracts some of the difficulties seen by autistic children. The relatively small study used a little over 100 children. They were split into 2 cohorts, one of 50 that received the intervention and 53 that did not. Of the 45 of the 50 that were tested again after the program was completed, only 3 of those were able to be qualified as having autism or being somewhere on the spectrum. Admittedly, 9 of the 45 children from the control group also were only able to be tested as positive for being on the autism spectrum. This is still a 3-fold improvement over the control group. Going now from examinations of children with autism to something somewhat closely associated, if you're to believe anti-vaxxers, vaccines, but this time for poison ivy. Poison ivy is one of those difficult plants. It can be useful in places if you're trying to deter pest animals, or your neighbours. In other cases, it's just a plain hindrance, causing a significant rash and in extreme cases anaphylaxis. The difficulty with this has always been just how to deal with it. Most of the common treatments that are advised online aren't going to work. To be blunt about it, topical or even inhaled cortisone won't do enough. If you get a large enough dose inside of you early on, it might, but realistically, very few people have access to the necessary prescriptions for that to happen. The reason why is surprisingly simple. It involves a pathway that doesn't involve histamines. Histamines are what most hay fever and allergy medications will target. Instead, it's interleukin-33, often given the acronym of IL-33. The vaccine under development at the University of Mississippi is interesting as it takes the active ingredient in poison ivy, urushiol, and it's synthesized. This is then injected in a small dose, and it's intended to desensitize the immune system. This would hopefully reduce or eliminate any reaction to poison ivy. The evidence early on is somewhat encouraging, but these are only in animal trials, and certainly will need to move on to human trials in the near future. This works for more or less exactly the same reason that vaccines work for other diseases. It trains the immune system that it should or shouldn't respond to certain things. In this case, developing some tolerance towards the active ingredient in poison ivy would mitigate the rash and itchiness. Going from actual promising news to quackery, a British Columbia naturopath claims that he can't be stopped from selling fecal transplant. These transplants will supposedly treat autism. As we've established at this point, autism is a neurological disorder. By the time it's diagnosed, most of what's going to happen in the brain has happened and it can't be reversed. This is a problem when you start selling treatments that are meant to solve it, whether they're bleach solutions or fecal transplants. No matter which it is, it's not going to work. Apart from the fact that it's a naturopath trying to sell what could arguably be considered either a pharmacological or medical treatment, we have some more significant concerns about the case being made in the British Columbia Supreme Court. They've taken the College of Naturopathic Physicians of British Columbia to court, asking them to intervene and stop them from telling people that this person's full of nonsense. What bothers us about this application is that it alleges the college has overstepped its powers by setting guidelines outside its jurisdiction to regulate the practice of naturopathy. Our understanding of this is one of two things. Either this is not a practice under the umbrella of naturopathy, in which case, why on earth is this person doing it? Or they believe that the college should not be regulating the actions of naturopaths, in which case, what point do they have? Where this debacle gets really messy is that the way it's set up is that the naturopath is based in Canada, specifically British Columbia. From here, they make arrangements for fecal transplant pills to be organized in Mexico. This allows them to circumvent a number of issues. The big one here is that the Naturopathic College has said, in no uncertain terms, it has no mandate to purport to protect patients who are receiving treatment in Mexico or any other place outside British Columbia, or otherwise restrict the treatment choices of patients outside British Columbia. You can see how having operated in one area and sending people elsewhere for treatment, things get a little bit awkward and difficult in proving who has responsibility for what and how. Perhaps this is just another example of one of naturopathy's basic tenets. The more you dilute something, like say enforcement of rules and having responsibility, the more powerful it becomes. Going now from one shitty story to yet another cesspit. Facebook. This time they're in trouble for claiming that they're not really the source of vaccine hesitancy, that this is just a natural phenomena growing out of people concerned. However, a report from the Wall Street Journal says that this might be a load of shit. Their report indicates that there are 150,000 user groups in Facebook that were disabled for spreading misinformation. 5% of these produced half of all the posts, and 1,400 invited half of the members of all of these. That means there's a tiny fraction of people responsible for a huge amount of impact, and it would indicate that Facebook really can't keep up with what the anti-vaxxers are doing. Admittedly, if you've spent much time on Facebook or YouTube recently, you would have seen that most videos that touch on any of the taboo topics, like COVID-19, wind up getting tagged by the system automatically, with authoritative sources, definitions from Wikipedia, and so on put underneath them, telling you what you should be thinking or believing. And while we don't agree with the practice, it is one measure that they've put in place to try and stop the spread of misinformation. Facebook has of course responded with the usual company BS. In this case, the quote reads, "Narrowly characterizing leaked documents doesn't accurately represent the problem," and it also ignores the work that's been underway to make comments on posts about COVID-19 and vaccines safer and more reliable. This is things that we've heard from many companies before now, and as said, the usual company BS, where actions speak far louder than the words that they're giving. In news related to another outbreak, there are now 25 states in the US that have an outbreak of unknown source of Salmonella. There have been over 100 infections confirmed, and it's affected over half the states in America. What is worrying here is that nobody quite knows where it's come from or how it's spread so quickly since the 2nd of September. What is more worrying is that the chances of it being a much higher figure than what officials have reconciled so far is there. Infections from Salmonella may go without much note initially by people who aren't already predisposed to a more serious condition. Further to that, it can take up to 4 weeks to track down if someone is part of an outbreak. This means you've got a combination of people who have no reason to be thinking they're part of it, a long time to follow up with them, and some people who may not even be aware of the fact that they are part of the outbreak because they've more or less avoided any symptoms. This range in issues of those who get extremely sick needing hospitalization and those who can shrug it off means that we don't know the exact numbers, but the official numbers are based on more serious cases, and that means over 100 individuals. Next is an interesting article coming out of Science. It explores how Neanderthals don't have a Y chromosome, or at least not the sort of Y chromosome we'd be more familiar with based on human DNA. The Y chromosome, for those of you who aren't immediately aware, is more or less what distinguishes a male from a female. Females have XX chromosomes, whilst males have XY chromosomes. The thing from this study is not so much that the Y chromosome is missing, but rather, the Neanderthal Y chromosome is missing and has been replaced with that of more or less a modern human. Modern human in terms of about 40,000 years ago, but still more or less unchanged from what we have today. And this is how they figured it out. They took primer sequences for chunks of human DNA from roughly that time frame and from other similar closely related lines of human evolution, in this case the Denisovians, and tried to figure out if they could get anything to match it using genetic testing. The human DNA worked, which shouldn't have happened. When they tried placing this in an order of the development of each species and when they split off to form their own, they figured out that somewhere between 100,000 years ago and 370,000 years ago, Neanderthals and humans started breeding together, and this led to the loss of the Neanderthal Y chromosome and it being replaced with the human Y chromosome. This is a very brief summary of what the article goes through, and we strongly suggest reading it because it is very interesting. In a technologically interesting article, it's the creation of a tiny flying robot, almost the size of the walls on your fingerprints. It's more or less just a microchip with a couple of wings attached to it. The robots themselves look almost like maple seeds, and they spin in the same way, almost like a helicopter. In doing so, they slow down their fall to Earth, and in doing so can travel further. The only reason this is possible is because they are made from incredibly tiny technology. Sensors, power sources, antennas, communication, and memory. All of this in something that in some cases is the size of a grain of sand. That kind of technology is ridiculously tiny. The researchers see these having a role in environmental monitoring, especially around air pollution, oil spills, and similar. They can be deployed in a large-scale operation to monitor for either a brief term or slightly longer term. The hope would be that by combining this technology with other technology, they can create a transient device that breaks down after contact with water. This is no small irony given that the intention of it is to monitor environmental pollution. If we were to consider this in a similar vein to iPhones and Apple Macs, the chances that it's creating a whole bunch of new technological waste every time they're deployed is entirely possible. The incorporation of a means to turn this into a benign end product that doesn't harm the environment while being used to monitor the environment and ensure it's looked after is all to the better. That's all the news we have for you this week. Thank you for watching. If you found it interesting, consider liking, sharing, and subscribing. Please post any comments, questions, or suggestions that you have below.